Hello, my name is Tertia Barnett, and I'm going to talk today about rock art and social change in Sahara. For most of this talk, I'll be focusing on the fieldwork and research that I've been doing in Wadi Al-Ajal in southwest Libya. So this is me. I work for Historic Environment Scotland in Edinburgh, where I'm running a project researching rock art, prehistoric rock art in Scotland. I'm also an honorary fellow at the University of Edinburgh School of History, Classics and Archaeology. I've been fascinated by rock art since I was a teenager, many years ago now, and I've been lucky enough to be able to work with rock art in Britain and North Africa for the past 20 years. So the Sahara is famous for its rock art. There are many thousands of painted and engraved rock surfaces across this vast desert region. There are particularly large concentrations, which are shown by the purple pink blobs on the screen, in certain areas of the Sahara, particularly associated with rocky and mountainous regions such as the Central Sahara. As this slide shows, you can see that there are distinct variations of technique and style in the rock art across the Sahara, from Morocco to Niger and Chad, and from Western Sahara to Egypt. There are also very similar themes in the rock art. The images typically depict a variety of wild African savanna animals, such as elephant, giraffe, gazelle, as well as domestic animals, particularly cattle, but also sheep and goat, horses and camels. And human figures are also a common theme in the Sahara. In addition to these, what we term figurative images, which represent something that we recognize, there are also many what we call non-figurative or abstract images. These can vary significantly from a simple shape, such as a circle, to a more complex motif, such as the ones shown on the left. These don't represent anything that we recognize today, and we find it very difficult to try and make sense of them and interpret them, but they encapsulated meaning and significance for the people that made them. So when was the rock art made? It's very difficult to date rock art precisely, but it's thought that the majority of it was created from around 6000 BC to the first millennium AD. During the earlier part of this period, of this 7,000 year time span, the climate in the Sahara and the environment in the Sahara was much wetter and greener than it is today. There are numerous lakes, rivers, and streams. And then it became increasingly arid from around 4000 BC. And the desert conditions that characterize the Sahara today were established within the last 3,000 years or so. This is a very general diagram. The scale and timing of changes varied in different parts of the Sahara. But initially, it's thought that the rock art was initially created at a time when the Sahara was greener and wetter and more conducive to human occupation. There's also been considerable social change during the period when rock art was created. From around 6000 BC onwards, we see a shift from hunting and foraging and fishing to mobile or semi-mobile pastoralism based on domestic animals, which spread across the Sahara from east to west from around 6000 BC onwards. Pastoralism initially was based on herding mainly domestic cattle, but then increasingly herding of sheep and goat as the climate became more arid, and eventually to domestic camels in more recent centuries. Sedentary farming using irrigation technology to grow domestic crops was only established during the first millennium BC, and then only in certain areas. In the Central Sahara, for example, the development of agriculture is linked to the emergence of the Garamantian civilization in the first millennium BC. So it's thought that rock art was initially produced by mobile or semi-mobile pastoral groups, and subsequently by both pastoralists and more settled farming communities. So that's the kind of very general background to rock art in the Sahara. I want now to move to the Wadi Al-Ajal and focus for the rest of the talk on the work that I've been doing there. The Wadi Al-Ajal is located in the central Sahara. The Wadi is a dry river valley in the Fezzan region of southwest Libya. It's situated at the northeastern end of this kind of crescent-shaped raised sandstone plateau called the Messac. And it's situated within this central Saharan region, which is very rich in rock art. If we go to the Messac, we zoom in a bit to the Messac here, the eastern side of the Messac is famous for its engraved rock art, particularly for the many thousands of realistic depictions of large wild animals such as elephant, giraffe, and even crocodile, such as the top right-hand slide shows. And also for its many images of domestic cattle, as shown at the bottom right-hand slide, as well as human figures and many abstract images as well. On this eastern edge of the Messac, the plateau slopes gently down to the desert floor, and the images are carved on the rock faces of many canyons or dry river valleys that cut deeply into this gently sloping edge of the Messac plateau. So we've got some other examples here of some of this very spectacular rock art from the Messac. The Wadi Al-Ajal landscape, on the other hand, is very different to that on the eastern side of the Messac. The Wadi is a wide, flat valley sandwiched between an extensive sand sea, the Ubari sand sea to the north, and the steep, rocky, and often inaccessible escarpment of the northern edge of the Messac. Today, the Wadi is fairly populous. There are numerous towns, villages, farms, and fields strung out along its length, and you can see the edges of some of the field systems in the two left-hand slides. So, today, the natural and cultural landscapes of the Wadi have changed dramatically over the 7,000-year period when the rock art was created. In the earlier part of the period, in the top slide shown, the top image shown here on the slide, the Wadi floor was occupied by a large lake fed by numerous streams and springs issuing from the escarpment, and there were also numerous smaller lakes in the Ubari Sand Sea to the north. Evidence for pastoral activity and occupation in the Wadi at this time is fairly minimal. It's restricted to mainly to surface scatters of stone tools, stone fragments, and pottery fragments. As the climate became increasingly arid from 4000 BC onwards, the lakes, streams, and springs began to dry up. And by the first millennium BC, surface water was very limited. The lake has shrunk significantly and continued to shrink until it dried up completely. And the water reserves instead were being, that was stored in the escarpment, were being harnessed through long irrigation channels called Figurative, which pulled the water out of the escarpment to supply the fields, villages, and towns in the Wadi floor, which was by that stage occupied by a fairly large Garamantian population. And these were ranged around what was then the Garamantian capital of Jarma, today the modern town of Jerma, which was the capital of the Garamantes between the first millennium BC and the first millennium AD. These maps are based on data from the Fezzan project, which is an interdisciplinary archaeological and geomorphological and paleoenvironmental project directed by Professor David Mattingly from Leicester University. So how does the rock art fit into this changing landscape? Well, before I started doing fieldwork in the Wadi, only a few engravings were known, and it was generally seen as a relatively impoverished area, a bit of a backwater compared to the very rich rock art landscape of the Eastern Messac and other parts of the Sahara. Several more rock art sites were identified during the Fazan project as a result of archaeological survey. And I made a couple of short reconnaissance trips in association with the Fazan project, which enabled me to identify a number of additional rock art sites in different parts of the Wadi. So overall, it seemed highly likely that there was considerably more rock art to be found. And as a result, with the support of the Society for Libyan Studies and David Mattingly, I embarked on a fieldwork project with a small team to survey and record the rock art along a 60-kilometre stretch of the Wadi between Taglit on the left, that sort of big promontory on the left, and the Bab el-Maknousa in the east. The Bab el-Maknousa is a wide natural break in the Messac escarpment. So the first task was to identify the nature and extent of rock art in the Wadi. And to do this, we undertook a systematic survey of the area on foot, walking up and down and along the rocky slopes of the escarpment and examining every rock surface that we found. As you can see, there's an awful lot of rock surfaces. We then, every time we encountered rock art, we made a detailed record of what we found, of the content and the context of every surface. We used a standardized toolkit comprising a text-based recording form for capturing quantitative data, measurements and so on, and descriptions, as well as making field sketches and digital photographs. We used a GPS or global positioning system to accurately record the location of each engraved rock surface. And this enabled us to then accurately map all the distribution of every rock art site onto maps and aerial photographs. And you can see here, this is the end of the Taglit promontory, a very dramatic rocky promontory. And mapping the rock art, every engraved surface, allows us to see that there is a big cluster, concentration of the rock art at the very end of the promontory, with very little along the slopes leading away from the promontory. We also used 3D recording, 3D modeling techniques to record a number of selected panels. We used both laser scanning and photogrammetry. And the idea for this was to see in more detail some faint aspects of the carvings, superimposition, and also the relationship between the carvings and the three-dimensional nature of the rock surface. So, for example, the lower two slides on the right show an elephant engraved onto a rock surface, and the natural roundedness of the rock surface has been used to accentuate the rounded bulbous head of the elephant. Our intention was to record every engraved surface that we found. This was not just recording figurative images, but every type of engraving. And the rationale for this was that every engraving represents human interaction with the rock surface and is therefore important for our understanding of past behaviour and for people's relationship with their surroundings. So we recorded, of course, all the figurative images, and you can see a selection here of the different types. And the bottom left-hand slide is very nice because it shows superimposition of different types of engraving over one another. So in addition to recording all the figurative images, we recorded abstract images and the many inscriptions that there are in the Wadi. A few of these are in Arabic and European scripts and are quite modern, but the vast majority are engraved in what is known as Tifana, which is the written language of the written script of the Berber language. As well as recording figurative images, abstract images and inscriptions, we recorded the many markings on the rock surfaces, which are very rarely acknowledged in Saharan rock art studies, but are an important part of this rock art landscape. And these markings included things like hollows, human-made hollows, grooves, incised lines, areas of abrasion where the rock surface has been rubbed away, and areas of pecking. So pecking is basically bashing the rock surface with another rock to make an indentation. And you can see the top left-hand side, there's an area of intense pecking over a figurative image. Some of these markings are functional, the result of functional activities. So, for example, the bottom right-hand slide shows a series of grinding hollows that may have been used for processing plant materials, animal materials, or some form of inorganic material such as ochre, or polishing stone to create polished stone implements. So what did this fieldwork find? What did it produce? Well, over 4 fieldwork seasons of 3 weeks or so each, we covered the whole survey area, the 60-kilometre stretch of the Wadi, and we identified and recorded almost 2,500 engraved rock surfaces during that time in all parts of the Wadi, and amassed a very large body of visual, descriptive and quantitative data. What did these engravings comprise? Well, a very large number of them were inscriptions and surface markings, different types of markings that I just mentioned, a smaller number of abstract images, but a very large proportion, also almost 2,000 rock surfaces engraved with figurative images. If we break down these figurative images and look at the individual types of images that are represented in the rock art, we can see that the majority of them depict animals, domestic or wild animals, but also a very large proportion depict what we've termed indeterminate images. And you can see an example at the bottom left in the picture there. These are images which are figurative, but it's impossible to tell exactly what they are, and it would be misleading to give a subjective interpretation. So we merely classified them as indeterminate. We also found a lot of the figurative images were classified as sandals, a few were chariots, and quite a large number of anthropomorphs or human-like figurative images. I'll just show you some examples of each of these types of engraving. So the bottom row, you can see sandal motifs, and these are literally sandal shapes or foot shapes, some of them with straps across them showing the sandal strap, and some of them associated with Tifana inscriptions. Chariots are quite well known in the Sahara. There are 160 or so examples, both engraved and painted, and we had 10 very nice examples in the Wadi. The right-hand picture in the chariots row shows not a chariot, but a lovely little engraving of a wheeled cart being pulled by a human figure. And the cart is bearing what is possibly a jar, a sort of rounded jar, and the human is walking towards the right, and you can see in motion his legs are moving. Very nice little image. The animals, the large proportion of domestic animals were cattle, but also a lot of horses and camels in particular, very, very few images of sheep or goat. And the wild animals that were depicted in the Wadi include the usual range of large African wild animals, savanna animals, of elephant, giraffe, gazelle, and also very nice birds, engravings of birds such as ostriches. So in order to try and start making sense of the data, of the rock art data, and to understand better the relationship between the rock art and the changing cultural and natural landscape of the Wadi, we first needed to organise all the engravings chronologically. The figurative images in the Wadi are carved in a variety of styles and techniques, which are closely comparable to those found in the Mesak, and elsewhere in the Sahara, for which there is a broad stylistic chronology. The engravings in the Wadi also depict a number of objects and animals which have a known date of introduction to the Wadi or the surrounding area. For example, domestic cattle are unknown in this region before the early 6th millennium BC. So where there are cattle engravings, the engravings must date to the 6th millennium BC or later. So these chronological indicators make it possible to anchor certain engraving styles within a particular time bracket. Other tools, such as superimposition of the motifs and the type of patina or weathering covering the engravings, are also important in determining their relative chronology. So the chronological framework for the Wadi engravings then shows us that they were created over at least 7,000 years. All the engraving styles from the Mesak are present in the Wadi. But surprisingly, we also identified an early style of engraving that has no direct parallels in the Sahara, although there is evidence of other forms of early engraving in some parts of the Central Sahara. So we called this early form of engraving the Wallpaper Style. This was a bit of a nickname because it's characterized by multiple small engravings of animals and cattle in particular, often covering the entire rock surface, almost like a wallpaper pattern where a design is repeated again and again on the wallpaper. The majority of these wallpaper style engravings were of cattle, and you can see a small inset on the bottom right of one of these motifs. They're very weathered and quite difficult to make out, but the majority of them did appear to be of cattle. In several cases, these engravings were superimposed by Buberline style animals, and therefore they are earlier in date. Because the majority of them depict domestic cattle, and because domestic cattle are unknown in Central Sahara before about 6000 BC, it's possible that these engravings represent a very early appearance, possibly the earliest appearance of domestic cattle in the Wadi at around 6000 BC or thereabouts. So, having established a chronological framework for the Wadi engravings, it was then possible to investigate the changing nature of the rock art over time and what this could tell us about changes in the way people used and made sense of their surroundings. So I want now for the rest of this talk to give you a kind of broad overview of some of the main patterns of change in the rock art that emerged from the data analysis. First of all, then, we're going to look at the changes of what was being represented in what was actually being engraved in the rock art. Overall, the largest proportion of figurative images are engraved, attributed to the so-called kind of pastoral style of engraving, which is dating probably between about 4000 BC and 1000 BC. Thereafter, the frequency of figurative images decreases, and there is a corresponding increase in abstract images and indeterminate images, as well as inscriptions. The figurative images also become much less realistic over time, and in the horse and camel rock art styles, they're much more schematic and often quite difficult to make out. If we look at this overall, then we can see that the rock art is becoming less representative and more ambiguous over time, suggesting perhaps that there are different ways of communicating social or ritual information. The later images and inscriptions may have required special knowledge to access their meaning, knowledge that may have only been held by particular people, and this information, this knowledge, could have been controlled or manipulated. If we look at the lower chart on this slide, the earlier figurative images, that is the wallpaper, Buberline, Tazina, and pastoral images styles, show a high proportion of domestic and wild animals relative to human figures. Whereas the later engravings the horse and camel style images, show a reduction in animal depictions and a relative rise in depictions of humans, anthropomorphic figures. These human depictions also in the later engravings often hold particular objects or use specific gestures that may be significant, may have particular social status or value. So what we may be seeing here is a change in social values with a growing emphasis on human concerns, a growing emphasis on individual identity and individual status within society. There are also significant alterations over time in how people were interacting with the rock surface and the social contexts in which the engravings were being made and used. The earlier images, for example, are primarily deeply carved. They would have taken considerable time to make. And what we see is that the same rock surfaces, or rock surfaces very close together, are carved with multiple images, as well as markings, lines and grooves and hollows and so on. And they appear to have been created by multiple hands, multiple authors, possibly people working together or within a communal context. Also, the carvings are frequently reworked or modified, suggesting that there was recurrent engagement, there was recurrent revisiting of these places, and that this interaction, this recurring interaction with the rock surface within a communal context was important. By contrast, the later engravings denote a very different form of engagement. They're typically small, simple, pecked images, often carved individually on isolated, uncarved or pristine rock surfaces. They represent rather rapid one-off actions by individuals. So we could perhaps term these private rock art in contrast to the more public rock art of the earlier engravings. In addition, there are clear changes over time in the spatial patterning of the engravings within the Wadi landscape. There are significant changes both in the distribution of the engravings and in the contexts in which they're carved. The earlier engravings on the top slide, the top map of this slide, in the earlier engravings, activity is densely clustered into a few specific places. And these few places share certain characteristics. They're all conspicuous landscape features, such as the ends of promontories, and they're typically situated at the ends of the few easily accessible routes into and out of the Wadi. And these same locations were carved repeatedly. They were used and reused by mobile pastoral groups over a long period of time, possibly several millennia. So it's possible that these places are where dispersed pastoral communities congregated at certain times of year or at certain time intervals. And these congregations, these aggravations may have been associated with certain rituals of which the production of rock art formed part. In a landscape with no permanent structures, the rock art may have been very important in creating significant places of in the landscape which were imbued with social meaning and memory. And the act of creating and reworking particular images and marking the rocks in these places may have been critical in helping to reinforce social cohesion and communal identity, but may also have provided opportunities for contesting and negotiating social values and social orders, and potentially, therefore, for facilitating social change. This spatial pattern, this very clear spatial pattern that's obvious in the earlier engravings, breaks down over time. And with the later engravings, the horse and camel style engravings, almost none of the places that were significant in the earlier carvings were used for these later carvings. Also, except for a couple of key locations, the later engravings are very dispersed throughout the survey area. We don't see this clustering into kind of rock art centres, if you like, in the later engravings. There's also a clear shift in the types of places selected for carving. These later carvings are associated with many different contexts, including small streams and springs, shallow rock shelters and rock clefts, as well as natural passes and minor paths into the Wadi. So this spatial patterning in the later engravings reflects a very different set of values in people's relationships with their surroundings, as well as with each other. There's no sense of continuity or collective endeavour, and instead there's an emphasis on individual actions and concerns. We don't know what the engravings were for or what they meant, but they may have served a variety of purposes, such as influencing how people used and moved through the landscape. And they may also have been used for things like protecting against supernatural forces that may have been believed to occupy certain natural places, such as rock cavities or pools of water and passes in the landscape. It's interesting that pre-Islamic beliefs maintain that jinn or malevolent spirits often dwell in exactly these kind of contexts, in water pools and natural places, in natural passes in the landscape and so on, and that marking these places provides a form of supernatural protection. So just coming to my final few slides then, I just want to sum up by saying this has been a very interesting study because it's very rare to have a comprehensive data set of rock art. The rock art in the Wadi is well preserved, it's very visible because there's no vegetation, and that's very unusual compared to many other parts of the world, particularly where I work in Scotland, for instance. So it's been possible to study this comprehensive data set and therefore to reconstruct a narrative of people's changing relationship with and perceptions of their surroundings over several thousand years. And as I've discussed in this talk, rock art is, we can consider rock art not as simply as a passive reflection of past society, but as an active agent in mediating social change. And if we see it in these terms, we might expect rock art production to be highest at times of social stress, when there's greatest need for social change and adaptation. And bearing this in mind, it's very interesting that the majority of the rock art in the Wadi was created during the pastoral period between around 4000 BC and 1000 AD, when the climate and environment in the Wadi were becoming increasingly arid and changing rapidly, and presenting significant challenges to the pastoral communities in this region. So that's the end of my talk, and I just want to say that if you were interested in this, the work has been published in greater detail in 2 volumes by the Society for Libyan Studies, which can be bought on the Society for Libyan Studies website. And just also then to say finally thank you to many people for making this work possible, particularly for the Society for Libyan Studies for their huge support for the project, as well as the British Academy, the Department of Antiquities in Tripoli and Sabha, and particularly also to David Mattingly for his continual support for this work, and to the Prazan Project and Desert Migration Project teams, but also especially to the stalwart members of my survey team that came out at various times. We always had a team of about 5 people in the Wadi at any one time. And thank you to Victoria and Co for putting together the publication. Okay, thank you very much for listening in particular.